Hello, my name's Julian Edgar, and I'm the author of this book, Designing and Building a New Energy Efficient Home. What I want to cover in today's video is the fact that building an energy efficient and comfortable house is basically pretty easy. Let's take a look. So what I find is that highly paid experts, energy advisors, passive house consultants, architects, these sort of people make the idea of building an energy efficient house sound complex and difficult, esoteric. Only certain people can do it and only certain people know how. But I don't think any of those things are true. It doesn't have to be complex and difficult to build an energy efficient home. All it needs is some basic ideas, fundamental ideas kept in mind from the very beginning. So what sort of ideas then? Well, these are the basics. Orientation. Orientation isn't where the front door of the house is, where that faces, or where the letterbox is. It's where most window area in the house faces. And in southern Australia, we want most window area to be facing north. That's so we can get winter sunshine into the house to warm the house up. Shading. We might want winter sunshine coming in, but we don't want summer sunshine coming in and making the house stinking hot. So we need some sort of shading that works in summer but doesn't work in winter. And that could be as simple as an eave, an overhang, as that diagram shows. It could be verandas. It could be deciduous trees. It could be porches. It could be external blinds. There's all sorts of ways of doing it, but external shading is critically important. So far, all we have is where most of the windows face and how do we shade those windows in one season but not another. It's not complicated. The next thing to get right is thermal mass. Thermal mass is anything inside the insulated envelope, inside the house, that stores heat and stores cool. And in most energy efficient homes that are well designed, that's the concrete floor slab or internal brick walls or internal brick feature walls or things of that sort. These store heat and store cool automatically. You don't have to do anything. The house just works by itself. The next thing to get right is ventilation. How can we get airflow through the house? Now you might think of that just as opening a single window, but at times to get a house to work at its best, we want a lot of ventilation airflow, cross-flow ventilation or convectional ventilation. I'll talk about those in a minute. That thermal mass absorbs heat in summer, keeping the house cool, and we want to be able to get rid of that heat, typically at night, by opening windows, opening sliding doors, and letting lots of airflow come through the house. It's not a hard idea. It's a very, very simple idea, but the house needs to be designed to allow plenty of ventilation flow when you want it and to stop that flow when you don't want it. Finally, on this list of basics, fundamentals, you want the internal layout of the home to be right. And that typically means placing living areas on the north, on that side of the house where it has most windows, and placing utility areas, including sometimes bedrooms, on the south, the side that doesn't get that sunshine. So the way you organise inside the house is important as well. Now, I don't think any of those 5 points is terribly hard to understand. I think they're all pretty straightforward, but you need to keep those in mind. The designer of the house needs to keep those in mind right from the very beginning of the design process. When you've got those things right, only then start looking at how the house is actually built, the fabric of the house. Things like how much insulation do you have in the walls? How much insulation do you have in the ceiling? How much insulation do you have in the roof? Those are things, insulation, that follow getting all those other things right first. The same with windows. Windows are very expensive in a house build, and so the U value, how much heat they let through, and the solar heat gain coefficient, how much sunshine they let through, are things that need to be understood and need to be applied, and good window manufacturers have that information available. But these are things that come second, after all the basics are right. And you'll often talk to people And if you say, oh, I've got an energy efficient home, it keeps me cool in summer and warm in winter, the first thing they'll say is, oh, it must have good insulation. But that isn't the first thing that actually matters. Or they must say, oh, you've got expensive windows. That's not the things that actually matter as much as getting everything right that we discussed on that previous slide. Things like orientation, thermal mass, shading, ventilation, things of that sort. So notice the order in which I've done it. Insulation, window quality, things like that actually come second on the list, not first. The other really important point to keep in mind is you want the house and the occupants to work with the environment, to work with the climate in which that house has been built. Now you might say, well, yeah, duh, isn't that obvious? No, it's not, because lots of approaches to energy efficient homes just try to cut out that external environment, just try to exclude that external environment to stop the owners and the occupants of the house having anything to do with what's going on outside. But you can see that that's not a very good approach. That doesn't take into account shading, that doesn't take into account sun angles, that doesn't take into account ventilation. That just says everything outside needs to be excluded. So if the primary features of the house are designed to simply shut out the environment, there's something wrong with the basic approach. I really believe that very, very strongly. If anything we've learnt over the last century of working within the environment is the more you work with the environment, the better the likely outcome. The more you try to simply exclude it or subjugate the environment, the poorer the eventual outcome will be. We work with the environment rather than seeing it simply as hostile, as an enemy. And in house design, that is critically important to get right. Work with the environment, not just simply trying to exclude it. Working with the environment, I've talked about shading, I've talked about ventilation, but here's another example, orientation. Orientation, which way the main window area of the house faces, as we've been describing. That's working with the environment. If you're completely ignoring the environment, you wouldn't even matter. You just face it any old way and simply use lots of insulation and really high levels of window and seal off the house from the environment. But that's not a good approach to take. Orientation and shading are good examples of working with the environment. And these diagrams showing the different paths that the sun takes in summer and in winter through the sky, which allows you to shade in summer but not in winter. Working with the environment, ventilation, cross-flow ventilation. So you can open windows down one side of a house and down the other side of the house, and the air sweeps through the house, going through the short path rather than finding its way through a more tortuous path, going the short path and evacuating any hot air from within that house. Convectional ventilation, where you have low inlets and high outlets, will work even when there's no wind. The air will be flowing out of those higher outlets, the hot air rising and flowing out, being replaced by cooler air being brought in through those lower vents. These are ideas about working with the environment, not just sealing your house off from the environment. So what can you end up with? You can end up with a home that's no more expensive than any normal volume-built house, but one that performs very well indeed. But that's if you actually take those ideas on board and work with the environment rather than trying to simply exclude it. Here's a picture of our house in construction, nearly finished, and it takes into account all of these ideas that I've been describing in this video, and its performance as measured temperature inside is really very, very good, especially when the cost was only, in this case, a fraction more than a volume-built house. Could it have been the same price as a volume-built house? Yes, it could have, because it uses standard construction walls, standard construction roof, off-the-shelf double-glazed windows, not super special windows imported from Europe or anything of that sort. It's all covered in the book. The book's not out yet. It'll be out mid or late 2026. I'm waiting until I have a full year of logged data for that house so that there's evidence for those points that I am making of how well the house actually performs. But the key point to remember is work with the environment, not just trying to exclude the environment. And you really need to start with those ideas from the beginning and not just do technological band-aids at the end to try and fix a house that fundamentally isn't a very strong performer. Start from the very beginning with those ideas, and it'll be actually quite easy to make a efficient, a relatively low cost and very well performing house. Thank you.